The ventilator hissed its mechanical lullaby, marking time in a room that smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. Then came the sound that didn't belong. The sharp pop of a champagne cork, followed by crystal singing against crystal. "To the end of an era," James whispered, his voice thick with relief. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't scream, couldn't even twitch a finger to knock that glass from his hand. But I could hear everything. I could feel Michelle's breath on my face as she leaned over the bed rail, her perfume, my perfume, the bottle from my vanity, overwhelming the sterile air. "God, James, can we open a window? The smell of sickness is making me nauseous," she said. Her heels clicked against the linoleum as she circled my bed like a vulture assessing carrion. "Soon, baby. Soon." His hand found hers over my body. Over my body. "Once the paperwork clears, we can finally breathe." I wanted to laugh. To scream. To rip the tubes from my throat and tell them exactly what I thought of their celebration. But my body was a cage, and I was the prisoner inside, watching through a glass wall as my husband toasted my death with the woman who'd been sleeping in my sheets. That's when I stopped praying to wake up and started planning what I'd do when I did. The memories came in fragments sharp enough to cut. I saw myself at 28, sitting across from James at that overpriced restaurant where he'd proposed. He'd ordered the lobster without looking at the price, his hand shaking as he opened the ring box. I'd said yes before he finished asking, dizzy with the possibility of being loved for something other than my last name or my quarterly earnings reports. My mistake was believing he meant it. I remembered our first month of marriage, working 18-hour days at Sterling and Cross Real Estate while James figured out his passion. I'd come home at midnight to find dishes in the sink and him asleep on the couch, the television still playing. I washed those dishes, make his lunch for tomorrow, iron his shirts for the interviews that never seemed to materialize. "You're suffocating me, Helen," he'd said once, watching me fold his laundry at 2 in the morning. I need space to find myself. I'd given him space. I'd given him everything. The brownstone in his name because he said it made him feel like a provider. The car lease because a man needs reliable transportation. The credit cards because how can I network without looking successful? What I didn't give him was the truth. That Helen Whitmore was just a character I played. That Helen Sterling, CEO Mogul, the woman who'd built a real estate empire before she was 30, was paying for every piece of his carefully constructed identity. His mother had looked me up and down at our engagement party, her lip curling. "I suppose you'll do. James deserves someone who'll take care of him properly." I'd smiled and nodded, writing the check for her mortgage the next morning. The one that kept her in that Philadelphia townhouse she loved so much. They thought I was small. Ordinary. A housewife playing dress-up in clearance sale clothes. They had no idea I was buying the buildings they walked past. Day 10. I'd been counting, marking time by the shift changes and the rhythm of James's visits. He came every day, playing the devoted husband for the nurses, his voice cracking at all the right moments. Then the door would close, Michelle would slip in through the private entrance, and the performance would end. "This is depressing," Michelle said, her fingers trailing across my bedside table. She picked up my reading glasses, the ones with the cheap plastic frames from the drugstore, and dropped them in the trash. "God, James, did she have to be so pathetic? Even her things are sad." "She likes simple," James said, but there was no affection in his voice, just explanation. Like describing the habits of something he'd kept in a cage. Made my life easier, I guess. Never had to worry about her wanting things I couldn't afford. Michelle laughed, sharp and bright. "Well, that's about to change. Have you seen the jewelry yet? Please tell me there's something worth selling." I felt her hands on my neck, checking for a necklace that wasn't there. The sapphire pendant my grandmother had left me was in a safety deposit box downtown, along with the rest of the pieces James had never seen. He'd thought my jewelry box contained costume pearls and sentiment. He'd never looked close enough to see the vintage Cartier, the estate Bulgari, the pieces I'd collected not for their value but for their stories. "There's some stuff," James said. "Nothing major. We'll have the estate sale clear it out. Michelle, baby, come here." I heard them kiss, long and wet, directly over my body. Michelle giggled. "The funeral is Saturday. Do you think it's too soon to move my things in on Sunday?" "Fuck it," James said. "Why wait?" She's not using the closet space anymore. Something broke in me then. Not my heart, that had shattered weeks ago when I'd first heard Michelle's voice in our bedroom, when I'd realized the late nights and business trips had been covering something far more mundane than I'd imagined. No, what broke was the last piece of Helen the housewife, the woman who'd scrubbed floors and ironed shirts and smiled through his mother's barbs because she believed that love meant service. In her place, something colder woke up. Something that remembered offshore accounts and legal clauses. Something that had built an empire while pretending to clip coupons. I stopped counting heartbeats and started counting assets. Every property James thought somehow paid for itself. Every small bank account he'd been slowly draining. Every signature he'd forged. Every expense he charged to cards he didn't know I monitored from my laptop while he slept. I stopped being the woman who died and became the one who'd been keeping score. Day 15. The sun cut through the blinds in stripes, painting prison bars across my chest. Inside my skull I was free. Inside my skull I was working. I remembered the codes. All of them. The passcodes to accounts James didn't know existed. The encryption keys to files he'd never thought to look for. The names and private numbers of board members who knew me as Miss Sterling, not Mrs. Whitmore. The prenuptial agreement sat in my lawyer's office downtown, signed by James on our wedding day without reading past page 2. I'd watched him skim it, drunk on champagne and possibility, scrawling his signature next to mine. He'd missed the clause about asset disclosure, the clause about infidelity, the clause that made everything, every single thing he thought was his, revert to me in the event of fraud or adultery. He'd signed away his life while I'd sipped champagne and smiled like a bride. "You're so thorough," he'd laughed, kissing my temple. "Always crossing your T's. That's my girl." His girl. His careful, thorough, small little wife who apparently had nothing better to do than read legal documents on her wedding day. I remembered Marcus Chun, my head of security, the man I'd hired to watch the office buildings but who'd ended up watching much more. He'd given me the file 3 months ago. Photographs of James and Michelle at the Ritz, at the beach house I'd bought for us, in restaurants I'd never been to because I was always working late. James's hand on her lower back. Michelle's laugh. The hotel receipts charged to my corporate card. I'd thanked Marcus, put the file in my desk drawer, gone home and made James his favorite dinner. Because I'd needed time. Time to move assets. Time to restructure holdings. Time to build a cage so perfect they wouldn't see the bars until the door locked behind them. The housewife had been my disguise. But Helen Sterling. She'd been planning this for months. I felt my finger twitch. Just barely. Just enough. The tide was turning and James was standing on the shore, too busy celebrating to notice the water rising around his ankles. Day 24. Dr. Reeves pressed his stethoscope to my chest during the morning exam, his movements routine mechanical. Then my hand closed around his wrist, weak but unmistakable. His eyes went wide. "Mrs. Whitmore? Keep them believing I'm dead." I whispered, my voice raw from weeks of silence. Every word felt like swallowing glass, but I forced them out. "Please." He should have called for nurses. Should have documented my awakening, celebrated the medical miracle, notified my family. Instead, he stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight, and I saw the decision forming behind his eyes. "I know who you are," he said quietly. "Helen Sterling. You gave the donation that built the children's wing. My daughter's name is on one of those bricks." He paused. "I've also met your husband. Several times." Understanding passed between us, silent and complete. 2 hours later, I was in a private room in the administrative wing, the kind of space reserved for VIP patients or people who needed to disappear. Dr. Reeves falsified my records, kept me listed as critical, no change. He brought me physical therapists who signed NDAs. Brought me my phone, the secure one, the one James had never seen. I made calls. Quiet ones. To Marcus. To my lawyer, Patricia Wu, who'd been waiting for this exact moment. To my CFO, who calmly confirmed that yes, all the failsafes were in place. Everything I'd built was still mine. Locked behind passwords James didn't know existed. My body was weak, muscles atrophied from weeks of stillness. But my mind was sharp and my rage was sharper. I worked through the pain, relearning how to stand, how to walk, how to move through space like the woman I'd been before I decided to play small. The funeral was set for Saturday. My death certificate was signed. The will, the fake one James knew about, leaving him the brownstone and a modest savings account, was ready for probate. James had no idea the real will was different, that the real assets weren't listed anywhere he'd ever looked. On day 28, I walked 5 steps without assistance. Dr. Reeves smiled. Your husband is coming at 4 for one last goodbye. The funeral is tomorrow at 11. I smiled back. Perfect. I hate being late to parties. The chapel at Riverside Memorial smelled like lilies and hypocrisy. I sat in Marcus's car across the street, watching the guests arrive in their black clothes and fake sympathy. James stood at the entrance greeting mourners, shaking hands, accepting condolences with practiced sorrow. He wore the charcoal Tom Ford suit I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary, the one I'd found on sale and pretended I'd gotten at Marshall's so he wouldn't feel guilty about the price. He looked expensive, refined, successful, everything he'd wanted to be. Wearing the costume I'd purchased, Michelle arrived fashionably late, slipping in through the side entrance. I could see her red dress bleeding through the gap in her black coat. She couldn't even commit to the mourning she was supposed to be performing. She took a seat 3 rows back, far enough to seem respectful, close enough to catch the attention of the estate lawyers I could see near the front. The service began. I watched through the car window as James took the podium, his voice carrying through the open chapel doors. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. Simple. Content. Never wanted much. Small joys. Marcus glanced at me. You ready, Miss Sterling? I checked my reflection in the visor mirror. The power suit I'd worn to my last board meeting. Navy Armani with sharp shoulders. Hair pulled back the way I wore it in Forbes. The sapphire pendant at my throat, the one James had never seen. The one worth more than his car. I looked like money. Like power. Like every inch of the woman I actually was. Helen Whitmore was content with small joys, I said softly. Helen Sterling built skyscrapers. I stepped out of the car. The walk to the chapel doors felt eternal and instant at once. I could see James still at the podium through the window, building toward his crescendo. She was the foundation of our life together, he said, and even from outside, I could hear the catch in his throat. Method acting at its finest. I don't know how I'll go on without her. I pushed open the chapel doors. The hinges didn't creak. Good quality hardware, probably installed by one of my contractors, but the silence that followed was deafening. Every head turned. James froze mid-sentence, his mouth still open on a word that would never come. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking on marble I recognized from the Italian quarry I'd sourced last year for the Belmont Tower project. 1 step. 2. 3. Every eye on me, every breath held. I stopped at the casket, mahogany, expensive, empty except for the clothes they'd apparently chosen to bury me in. I looked down at it, then up at the congregation. Interesting, I said, my voice carrying in the shocked silence. I don't remember dying. James made a sound like a wounded animal. Michelle's face had gone white. I turned to my husband, taking in every detail. The suit. The watch I'd bought him for Christmas. The wedding ring he'd never taken off, even when he was with her. Did you enjoy the champagne, James? The one you opened over my body? You said, and I quote, to the end of an era. You were right about that. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. I shifted my gaze to Michelle, still frozen in her seat, one hand clutching her phone. The ring doesn't suit you, I said conversationally. You tried it on what, day 7? It was custom-sized. For a woman with working hands. I held up my own hand, showing her the faint calluses from years of typing, of handling contracts, of building things while everyone around me assumed I was just decorating them. Helen, James finally found his voice. Helen, I can explain. Can you? I smiled. It didn't reach my eyes. Can you explain how you drained what you thought was my savings account? The one you believed was my little nest egg? The $12,000 you spent on Michelle's bracelet? The car lease you signed in my name? The credit cards, the loans, the expenses you charged to accounts you thought I was too stupid to monitor. His face crumbled. I thought you were dying. I thought. You thought I was dead, James. There's a difference. I pulled my phone from my pocket, luxury slim. Nothing like the cheap Android he'd seen me use. You thought I was Helen Whitmore. The simple housewife who clipped coupons and cleaned your mother's house. You never knew Helen Sterling. I dialed. Put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. Patricia Wu, came the crisp voice of my lawyer. Liquidate the spousal accounts, I said calmly, looking directly at James. Remove James Whitmore from all properties. Terminate his access to Sterling and cross-company cards. File the infidelity clause paperwork. Yes, all of it. Confirmed, Miss Sterling, Patricia said. I'll have the documentation to the courthouse within the hour. I hung up. James's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. I watched him pull it out with shaking hands, watched his face go from confused to horrified as notifications rolled in. Account frozen. Access denied. Card declined. Property lien notice. What did you do? He whispered. Helen, what did you do? I stopped playing dead, I said. And I started collecting debts. Michelle's phone lit up with the same notifications. I watched her face change as she did the math, as she realized the man she'd been sleeping with wasn't wealthy, wasn't successful, wasn't anything but a parasite who'd been feeding off me. She stood, looked at James, looked at her phone, and without a word she walked out of the chapel, her heels clicking fast, final, gone. James lunged for her. Michelle, wait, Michelle, I can explain. She didn't turn around. He spun back to me, desperate now, the mask completely shattered. Helen, please. I'm sorry. I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can. Fix what? I asked. Your career that was just a courtesy position at my company? Your car that's leased in my name? Your apartment that I own? Your life that I funded? I stepped closer, close enough to smell my perfume on his collar. You wanted to breathe without me, James. Good luck. I was your oxygen. I turned to the congregation, to the sea of shocked faces. Some I recognized, James's friends, his family, people who'd looked at me like an accessory for 5 years. Others I didn't know, probably Michelle's allies, people here to watch a woman be erased. Enjoy the wake, I said. The food's already paid for. I'm a big believer in not wasting things. I walked back down that aisle, past my empty casket, past my sobbing husband, past the life I'd pretended to live. Marcus held the door open. The sunlight hit me like a blessing. Behind me I heard James calling my name. Heard him begging. Heard the sound of a man realizing he'd mistaken kindness for weakness, and was about to spend the rest of his life paying for that confusion. I didn't look back. The corner office of Sterling and Cross had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown. From 40 stories up, the city looked like a circuit board, all lights and orderly chaos. I'd been back in this chair for 3 days, and it felt like I'd never left. My assistant brought in the morning reports. The Belmont Tower closing went through. The investors from Tokyo confirmed. And Mrs. Whitmore, she caught herself. Miss Sterling, your former husband's lawyer called again. What does he want? Apparently Mr. Whitmore is requesting a meeting. He says it's urgent. I thought about James in the courthouse, realizing the brownstone wasn't his. Thought about him at the bank, discovering the accounts were empty because they'd always been empty, just shells I'd maintained to make him feel secure. Thought about him at his mother's townhouse, probably, hat in hand, learning I'd stopped paying her mortgage the day after my funeral. Tell his lawyer no, I said. And blocked the number. She nodded and left. I turned back to the windows, watching the sun paint the buildings gold. My phone buzzed, Marcus sending me a photo. James walking out of the courthouse, his expensive suit looking somehow cheaper now. His shoulders slumped. In 3 days he'd aged 10 years. Michelle had already posted on social media from Cabo with someone new, someone who actually had money. She'd lasted exactly as long as his bank balance. I deleted the photo. Opened my desk drawer. Inside was my wedding ring, the custom band I'd worn for 5 years, sized for hands that knew how to work. I picked it up, felt its weight, remembered the girl I'd been when I'd put it on. The girl who'd thought love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel big. I'd mourned that girl during those 28 days in the hospital bed, listening to the man she'd loved celebrate her death. I'd let her go. Let her rest. Patricia Wu had called it the cleanest divorce I've ever processed. No assets to split because James had never actually owned anything. No alimony because the prenup he'd signed without reading had waived his rights the moment he'd cheated. No custody to fight because we'd never had children. Thank God for small mercies. He'd walked away with exactly what he'd brought to the marriage. Nothing. My mother called that evening. "Helen, darling, I saw the news. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom." "Are you?" She paused. "You played that role for so long. The devoted wife. The simple life. I worried you'd forget who you really were." I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. Armani suit. Sapphire pendant. Hair pulled back. The woman who'd built this empire before she was 30, who'd expanded it while pretending to be someone else, who'd survived her own funeral and come back sharper. "I never forgot," I said. "I just took a vacation from myself. It's over now." "Good," my mother said. "That girl was always too small for you anyway. Your grandmother would be proud." After we hung up, I stayed in the office until midnight, working through acquisition proposals and development plans. The same work I'd been doing for years, but now without the pretense. Without rushing home to make dinner for a man who couldn't taste my effort. Without pretending my ambitions were hobbies, my empire a side project. The city sparkled below me, and every third building had my fingerprints on it. Sterling and Cross Properties. Sterling and Cross Developments. The legacy I'd built while everyone thought I was just Helen Whitmore. Housewife, simple, content with small joys. I played small for a man who couldn't handle my size. I dimmed my light so he wouldn't feel blind. I'd whispered my achievements so his failures wouldn't sound so loud. Never again. I put the wedding ring in the back of the drawer, underneath old contracts and forgotten business cards. Maybe someday I'd sell it. Maybe I'd melt it down. Maybe I'd just leave it there. A reminder of the price of pretending. My phone lit up with a notification. Forbes wanted to do another profile. The woman who walked into her own funeral. Helen Sterling's return to power. I smiled and scheduled the interview. Let them write about the resurrection. Let them document the return. Let every man who'd ever underestimated a woman see what happens when she stops playing dead and starts playing for keeps. I'd given James everything. My time, my money, my smaller self. And he'd thrown a party when he thought I was gone. But I wasn't gone. I was never gone. I was just waiting to take back what was always mine. The city lights blinked like stars, like promises, like the future I'd built with my own hands. And this time I was building it for me. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Beyond the Scripted.